good afternoon, evening to all of you. My name is Mikiala Tennie, and I'm one of the youth directors here at Resurrection, specifically here at the Leawood location. Have we had a good weekend, y'all? Yes! I have also had a good weekend, and to all of our families that are joining us, thank you for being here and sharing in these final moments that we get to spend to kind of wrap up all that we have been talking about, all that we have been learning. I do want to catch you guys up a little bit. So our theme for the year is actually Metamorphosis, in line with Meta, which is our middle school retreat. And so we've really been talking about what metamorphosis means, and we've been using it through this imagery of a caterpillar and the journey that a caterpillar goes on. And so, we've started off talking about the moments when we find ourselves kind of just like a little caterpillar, where we are faced with life circumstances and all that we have in front of us, whether it's good or bad or ugly. And we have opportunities as people to learn to look at the spectrum of our lives and understand that throughout that journey, God is a constant who is constantly loving us in the midst of all of that. In the midst of all of life changes, God is there constantly loving us through it all. And we talked about how sometimes these changes that we go through in life, they might be directly because of our actions. There are actions and consequences. There are actions and good things that happen. So sometimes we have a say or we have input in those experiences that we have as life changes. And then sometimes in life, it feels like life just kind of happens at us and we're just hanging on for dear life. The circumstances are completely out of our control. It's not because you did something good or bad, it's just life happening. And we've learned that even when you can't see it, God is growing something beautiful from the yuck of life. And so we looked at that idea of a caterpillar in a chrysalis, and we kind of used the historical text we find in scriptures about the people going through exile. So essentially they were kicked out of their land. So this was a situation where there was some actions and consequences, and then life happened at them. And so the Israelites found themselves having to be pushed out of the land that they called home. The temple, the place where they gathered to commune with God and to commune with each other, had been torn down and ransacked. And life was not feeling good for people in these moments. And so we've talked about the prophet Ezekiel, and his job was to warn the people that these changes in life, these difficult circumstances were on the way. These things were coming, they were happening, and really all you could do was kind of prepare your mind and your heart for it. But Ezekiel was also tasked with the job of helping them find hope in the midst of those changes. To understand that even as they're going through these changes, God could grow something beautiful from those moments. And so as we think about that, we have to wonder, okay, well, what's next in the story? Well, Ezekiel's book in scripture, it ends with him kind of reiterating to the people that they could have hope for the future. But the happily ever after that we kind of always hope for, the happily ever after that we just kind of think that, well, maybe God will just make it happen, it didn't happen for them in that exact moment. And so I'd love to stand here and tell you that the people who were pushed out and had to go into exile, that they lived happily ever after. They were able to return to their home, and they went through that caterpillar stage in the yuck of the chrysalis, and everything turned out great. I would love to tell you that. Thing is, it took 70 years for them to be able to actually get back to their land. And then there was the task of rebuilding the temple and figuring out how to make their city safe and how to move forward in the midst of all of that. So they did make it home, but it was still a little bit yucky. And I'd love to stand here and tell you that after returning home, they rebuilt that temple and they were able to have community with God and each other again in that space that they held dear, that sacred space. But that didn't happen right away. And in fact, There were many people who tried to encourage the people and spur them on and say, we can do this, we can finish it. And it didn't quite happen. So when we think about our story, it's unfortunate, but those changes that they had to deal with, that was just something that kept on going. And honestly, when we think about it, their lives were not so different from ours after all. Because when you think about it, it's really just a pattern. Things happen, things change, life goes on. Sometimes things change for the better, sometimes they change for the worse. And there's moments where people are sitting in this and thinking, okay, we've made it through another phase, and that felt really good, but now it feels like we have so much more work to do, and what do we do? And it just feels like it's constantly going and going and going, and it feels like those ellipses that you see in a story where it's just dot, dot, dot. What is actually going to happen next? And so you might have, in the midst of all of this, you might have these butterfly moments where you go from caterpillar through the yuck of the chrysalis, and all of a sudden things are great and that feels amazing. But then something else changes out of your control. And it happens again and again. And there's that pattern. I remember when I was in 8th grade, I had someone I considered to be just the absolute best of friends. And I'm gonna date myself here, but we would get home from school and immediately log online to AOL Instant Messenger, because we didn't have no phones. So we would get onto our computers, and the only computer that was available was in the family room in the middle of the house. So everybody was waiting for you to finish these conversations. But we were so excited to talk to each other again after school, we would log on, and our parents would say, what could you possibly have to talk about? You've seen each other all day. What is happening now? And somehow, me and this friend, we always had something else to talk about. You know, sometimes you get home, you just kind of have to decompress from the day. You have to rehash all the things that happened. And we did that online. And the funny thing about it is that with AOL Instant Messenger, you would log on, and it would make this sound where the door would open, and it would let you know whose friends were there and who you could talk to, and you had to figure out all of those things. And then if a friend left, it would slam shut. You'd know that your friend was gone. And so I would log on, and I would hope that my friend would be there, and if I didn't see her name listed, I would wait for the noise for the door to open to know that she was there and I could talk to her, and we could figure out all of the things that we needed to figure out for the day. And so I remember that one day we made this plan online, and we said, okay, we're gonna have a sleepover, because we thought that would be the best time ever. So we scheduled this sleepover, and I have to tell you that my parents were so very annoyed with us, because we were the type of people that we really love music. Like, I always love worship. We always listen to all these different artists. And so we planned this sleepover, and we spent the entire night singing to all of our CDs, to the point that my parents woke up the next morning, and they were like, listen, I don't know what y'all would be able to do with each other if you couldn't harmonize, because y'all did that all night long. But that was the kind of friendship that we had, right? We'd spend all that time together. And so I remember we made another plan where we were gonna go to a concert together, because we had this artist that we had been following, and they were going to be in concert at a church. And we had the opportunity to do that solo, because we both had really strict parents who wouldn't really let us out of their sight, but it was a Christian concert, it was happening at a church, so they said, okay, sure, you can go. So we had this freedom, right? So we go to the concert, and we have all of this fun. We're singing, we're dancing, we're laughing. And I just thought, this was the best night ever. Our friendship is so solid. And then a couple days later, we realized that as 8th graders going into high school, we would not be going to the same high school. And so I thought to myself, it's fine. It's gonna be okay. Our friendship is strong. It's gonna be all right. We can make it through this. It'll be a little bit tough, but we can do this. But what I noticed is that little by little, this friend of mine, she just started hanging out with different people more and more. And so when I would log online and hope to see her, to chat with her, she wouldn't be there. Or when I would try to schedule a sleepover so that we could stay up all night and sing, she wasn't available for that. And I have to tell you, it wasn't that she went off and started hanging out with all these friends that were a bad impression on her. She was just hanging out with different people. It wasn't necessarily bad or good, but it felt bad to me. And that was a change that I was forced to reckon with and figure out, well, what is next? And it broke my heart to know that this friendship with all of these great memories, it really didn't matter as much to her as it mattered to me. And I thought I was gonna handle this super well. I didn't pitch a fit. I didn't go to school and say, hey, what is going on? What's wrong with you? Instead, I just kind of bided my time and I said, you know what, we're in 8th grade. Things are changing and I'm thinking I'm handling this very mature. And I said, you know what, the end of the year is coming up. So I'm just going to approach her and I'll try to be the bigger person, and I'll say, listen, I know we haven't talked to each other in a while. I know we haven't really been as close as we used to be, but let's just shake on it and wish each other well and go on with our lives. And so the last day of school came and I readied myself and I was like, okay, it's now or never. You're just gonna be a good person, you're gonna talk to her. And so the bell rang for the end of school and everybody has this moment where they realize all of a sudden it's high school next. We have this life ahead of us. And I see her as she's exiting the school and I called out to her and it felt like she just started speeding up. And I was like, gosh, she's gonna make this real hard. But I thought, you know what, it's okay. I'm gonna do this thing that I plan to do because I feel like it's the right thing to do. And so I called after her again. And all I remember was her saying, what? She didn't even turn around and look at me. She just kept going. And I thought, ooh, that doesn't feel good. And that was it. Didn't see her again after that. Because life happens and things change, people grow, and people grow in different directions. And so for me, because it was so sudden, it felt like one of those ... moments in life where you think you've grown, you think you've changed, you think you've handled something in a way that you're supposed to, and it still doesn't quite feel triumphant. You think you've gone from the caterpillar, you went through the chrysalis, and now you think it's a butterfly moment and you've made it, and the butterfly moment doesn't feel as awesome as you thought it would. And so sometimes the stories of our lives, no matter how much we change or people around us change, they just feel unfinished. Kind of like the story of the people who came back from exile and one thing after the other kept changing. And so as we've talked over the weekend, Ezekiel's job was to continue to bring hope to people in the midst of their ... phase. And Ezekiel was reminding them that God promised to bring a new heart and a new spirit. And if you're like me in that situation, you're wondering, listen, God, I've read the Bible, I've heard the scriptures. Where is this new heart? Where is this new spirit? And Pastor Ashley, she talked about those bones that God breathed into and they breathed life. And you might think, I feel so dry and brittle and hurt, and I don't feel that breath of life. And so those people who experience that exile, they're like, where's this promise? What's happening? But here's the thing, the prophets who were chosen to bring them these messages of hope, they weren't just talking about having a new heart and a new spirit inside of them. They also knew that they were supposed to tell people about the future things that they were going to encounter years and years and years from now, lifetimes from now. And so the prophets knew to tell the people about a coming Messiah. And so one of the themes that these prophets would share often is that there was hope because of the coming Messiah. And we know that to be Jesus, our Messiah. And so here's something that Jesus said. I want to read this verse from John chapter 11. It says, Jesus himself said, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And so it points to all those long-awaited hopes that the prophets were talking about, are hopes that rest on Jesus, who was going to be resurrected. So all of those Old Testament stories and thoughts, they point to the New Testament, and they point to the person of Jesus, and they point to that pattern. Because as you change, the pattern continues. We go through life, we change, we grow, we have some butterfly moments, and then we do it again. Life happens, you change, you grow, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. And either way, God's love still remains constant. And here's the thing, Jesus experienced that pattern too, because when Jesus came here to earth, Jesus did ministry. He lived, and then he died, and then he rose again and lived through that resurrection. So here's what I want for all of us to remember. Our theme this weekend is, in fact, metamorphosis. And this is what metamorphosis means. It means a change of physical form, structure, or substance, especially by supernatural means. So we didn't pick this theme willy-nilly, because we're talking about change in you, in our hearts, especially by supernatural means. And so I want us to connect that idea to this idea of resurrection and hope, because resurrection, it definitely talks about the rising of Christ from the dead, Jesus the Messiah, but resurrection, it means rising again to life of all the human people, all of us. We get to experience resurrection. So metamorphosis, our theme for us, is synonymous with resurrection. Resurrection is where we find our hope in all of the changes that we go through, in all of the patterns that we have to deal with, because resurrection isn't just the name of our church. Resurrection is the pattern that we see throughout the story of God. We see it in nature, in people, in circumstances. We see it in you, and we see it in me. So I want for you to always look for the pattern. Because of Jesus, there is always a pattern of resurrection, because it is also your story. So as you're going through life and things start happening and you're going through this metamorphosis and these changes over and over and over again, I want you to ask yourself, where has God resurrected me purposely? Where has God brought me back to life? Where can you find the patterns of that metamorphosis over and over and over again? Because here's the thing. When you recognize those patterns, you get to lean into the butterfly that we've been talking about. You get to lean into those moments where we experience that resurrection and that metamorphosis. You have the opportunity to live in that butterfly mode. And so over and over again in God's promises, we see the promise of the resurrection, the promise of Jesus, the hope of Jesus. So when we read in the scriptures and we hear that God will give us a new heart, we know it's because God is a God of resurrection. And when we think about those butterflies and we remember that imagery, we're to remember that resurrection is our hope. And so in your life, when you experience that butterfly mode, in those moments where you felt the changes and you've grown, whether it's been good or bad, and you've come out on the other side, we have an opportunity. And so I'll remind you that Pastor Leah, she talked about what to do when we feel lost in those moments. And so I want you to think about those things and remember them in those moments. And then Pastor Ashley, she said it's up to us to choose to accept the life that God breathes into us when we feel broken and brittle. We get to choose that and then live it out. And then in those moments, I want you to remember the promises that God has for you, because even in the yuck, God is forming your wings as a butterfly. And so what I want for us to think about right now in these moments is how to use those wings. If you're the butterfly, if you're going through this constant change, you're going to have to figure out if you're going to fly or not fly. You're gonna either decide if you're gonna flap those wings and move forward, and you're gonna have to figure out what you're gonna do in the midst of that. And so the last thing I want for us to think about is the monarch butterfly. We've seen these pictures of a caterpillar going through the chrysalis and then becoming a butterfly. And here's what I want you to think about. Monarch butterflies, when they're doing their migrations, when they're traveling throughout the world, they follow the shorelines together to avoid getting lost. These monarch butterflies, even though they migrate individually alone, they still do it together as a pack. And so what will happen is at night, you'll find them in trees grouped together, huddled at night, and they call it a roost. And then this roost, they understand that that happens because they're seeking protection from predators and to keep warm. And that's not so different from us, right? We're on this life individually, but together. And we have to figure out what's going to happen next. And so it's our job to figure out how to do that together. How are we going to fly together, even though we're on our individual journeys? And so if you're living in this resurrection, if you're living in that hope, in that butterfly mode, then I want you to do a couple of things. I want you to remember who God says that you are. And we know that God says that you are loved. I want you, as you fly, to remind other people who God says they are, because God says they are loved. And then I want you to encourage other people to fly. And I want you to fly together, because that's what it means to live in the hope of the resurrection. To remember who God says you are, to remind other people to fly so they can fly with you too. And so in these next couple of moments, I want for us to do something. Some of you, when you came in, you got a sticker of a butterfly. If you didn't get a sticker, that's okay. There's gonna be some up here. But as we think about finishing up this weekend and what it means to be a butterfly, to stretch our wings and to actually fly, to think about what that means in the hope of the resurrection and it not just being a name, but being a lifestyle, but being who we are, I want you to take that butterfly. And then as you're able and when you're ready, I want you to come up here. Because up here, we've got the imagery of resurrection. Because Jesus didn't stay in the tomb, right? Jesus was resurrected. And because of Jesus' resurrection, we get to be resurrected. We get to live in hope. We get to have those butterfly moments. And so as you take your time, I want you to reflect and think about what it's going to mean for you to lean into that hope and that resurrection. And as the band comes and plays, I want you to come up here and place your sticker. And my hope is that we'll all get to see the imagery of what it means to be butterflies that fly together and that live in that resurrection. So come with your stickers as you're able and place them up on the tomb.